Thoughts on prayer. One of my all-time favorite movies is Steven Spielberg's adaptation of the novel by Alice Walker, The Color Purple. I don't recall when I first saw it or how old I was, but I know I've always been captivated by the film, no matter how many times I've seen it. Though I've watched the movie countless times throughout my life, it was only a few years ago, while purchasing books for my classroom library, that I picked up a copy of the novel and began to read it. Like all books adapted to the big screen, I found I had been missing so much all these years watching the movie version. One thing, however, was not omitted from the movie, and yet it was not until I read the words on the page that I really noticed that the majority of the book is written as a prayer. Dear God, the book begins. I am 14 years old. I am, scratched out and changed to, I have always been a good girl. Maybe you can give me a sign letting me know what is happening to me. If you've watched the movie or read the novel, you're well aware of the circumstances that give rise to this prayer. The protagonist, Celie, is assaulted by the man she believes to be her father, verbally abused by her dying mother, who cannot face the reality of what her husband is doing to her child, and forced to carry a child that she knows will be taken from her. The trauma this young girl details on just the first page of the novel is more than most people will face in a lifetime. And yet, with each subsequent page of the novel, her suffering continues, and her plight becomes all the more tragic. And yet, chapter after chapter begins with the same words, Dear God. Now, there's nothing unusual about a person experiencing abuse or hardship turning to God in prayer. But Celie's prayers are not a cry for help or deliverance. She seems to hold no expectation that God might intervene. She simply addresses God as one might address a pen pal whom they never expect to meet face to face, or as one might address a diary that no one else will ever read. What is the use in praying if we don't believe God is going to intervene in our situation? This is a question many of us have likely pondered at some point in our lives. It is certainly a question I wrestled with as my faith began to shift. As an evangelical, prayer was the bedrock of my theology as well as my relationship with God. We believe that the biblical model of prayer, as set by the Old Testament prophet Daniel, was to set aside time for prayer at least 3 times a day. Of course, that did not include the prayers we said before every meal or impromptu prayers that we might say throughout the day as needs arose in either our lives or the lives of those we love. Then, of course, there were the many prayers we said in church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and for the seriously devout, a special Monday night gathering where all we did was pray for an hour. We genuinely believed that our standing with God was directly proportional to the amount of time we spent in prayer. Our spirituality depended on the volume of our prayers. And when I use the word volume, I mean that in more than one way. Both volume as in the amount of time we spent in prayer, but also volume as in the decibel level of our prayers. There's a scripture in the New Testament that reads, "The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much." We took that to mean that prayer required intensity. And somehow intensity always translated into praying as loudly as the time and place would allow. When I was a student at Holmes Bible College, a Pentecostal seminary in Greenville, South Carolina, students in the men's dormitory had a ritual of going up in the attic each night where we would pace the entire length of the dorm, praying just one floor above our fellow students, most of whom were socializing or studying. Most students being Pentecostal, we were accustomed to vociferous prayer, so they thought nothing of the commotion above. But one student, a Southern Baptist, who liked to be in bed by 9 p.m., was less amiable to the pacing prayer warriors above. One evening, we all heard our silent Southern Baptist friend marching angrily up the stairs to the attic. Flinging the door open, he shouted in a voice louder than any Pentecostal had ever prayed, "God is not deaf." His tantrum did not silence the pacing Pentecostal prayer warriors, but his loud outburst may have served as one prayer that God answered, as the next day several students in the dorm thought it would be both helpful and humorous to purchase earplugs for our Southern Baptist friend. I tell this story One, just because I love this story, but more importantly, to illustrate the centrality of prayer to my former religious life. We prayed often, and we prayed with our whole being because we believed prayer held the power to move the very hand of God. So what happens to prayer when you begin to doubt there is a God who hears and answers prayer? Just to be clear, I never stopped believing in the existence of God, but my understanding of God did change significantly. From a traditional monotheist, I evolved into a panentheist, but I'm still a theist nonetheless. Even though I still believe in the existence of God, I no longer believe in an interventionist God. In the past, when I went to a hospital room and prayed with a friend, church member, or a member of my family who was sick, possibly on the verge of death, I called upon God, believing God's goodness would cause him to hear my prayer and intervene. But later on, as I began to question matters of my faith, I asked myself, how is it good for a God who is all-knowing to heal the friend or family member that I'm praying for, but to allow the person in the next room to die because no one is praying for him? How is it good for God to intervene in a situation only if I pray fervently, but to withhold his assistance if I happen to be too lazy that day or too hoarse from yelling at God the night before? The idea that a compassionate God only shows compassion or shows greater compassion for those who have someone praying for them really doesn't paint a very compassionate picture of God at all. This idea is expressed by the Venerable Mahathera, who wrote, "Nature is impartial. It cannot be flattered by prayers. It does not grant any special favors on request." Even though I no longer believe in a God who hears and answers prayer, still, like the protagonist in The Color Purple, I continue to pray. I don't pray as long, loud, or as often as I used to, but I still pray. And though I no longer have an expectation that God will hear my prayer and intervene in the situation, I still believe there is some value to praying. In his book, The Heart of Christianity, Marcus Borg readily confesses that he does not believe in an interventionist God, but at the same time, he cannot deny that there is some efficacy to prayer, whether its explanation is psychosomatic or paranormal. He writes, "And this leads to my final reason for continuing to do prayers of petition and intercession. To refuse to do them because I can't imagine how prayer works would be an act of intellectual pride. If I can't imagine how something works, then it can't work. To think thus involves more than a bit of hubris." This past December, when the House of Representatives voted to pass the Respect for Marriage Act, which, if the Obergefell decision were ever overturned, would force states to recognize same-sex marriages performed in other states, I checked to see how my congressional representative voted. The Savannah area is perfectly gerrymandered to be represented by conservative good old boy Earl Buddy Carter, so I already knew how my representative voted. Still, for some reason, when I read the word nay by my representative's name, it bothered me. And so I called his office in D.C. to ask why my representative considers me a second-class citizen not deserving of the same guarantee of equal protection under the law as other citizens. When his staffer gave me a dismissive answer, I requested a face-to-face meeting so my representative could look me in the eye and tell me I do not deserve the same rights as others. It took a month of daily phone calls and emails, but finally an appointment was made to meet with Representative Carter. And the Sunday before, when my church in Savannah asked for our joys and sorrows, I asked my church family to pray that I would say the right things and that my voice would be heard. Just a few months ago, I received a phone call from WTOC News. As most of you know, I resigned from Effingham County High School in 2021 when I was asked to silence the voices of black students who spoke out against racism, and when I was told that Black Lives Matter has no place at the school, a school whose mascot is a Confederate rebel, a school with a Confederate flag on the sign in front of the school. This year, a civil rights lawsuit was filed against the school and school district, and so I was asked to do an interview about my experience at the school in light of the pending litigation. I did not hesitate to agree to the interview. In fact, I had already spoken with one of the plaintiffs and pledged to do anything I can to support them. But when I pulled up to the TV station, feeling nervous that I'd had very little time to prepare my thoughts, I found myself whispering a prayer. Now, I don't believe that God was sitting on a throne in heaven and that he, hearing my prayers and the prayers of my church family, rushed to Buddy Carter's office or to the television station to give me the right words to say. But knowing my church was praying for me did give me greater confidence, allowing me to speak boldly to my congressman. And whispering that prayer in the parking lot of WTOC did make me feel just a little less angst speaking to the reporter. I don't know how prayer works. I won't testify 100% that it does work, but I also won't say that it doesn't work. In my evangelical days, we often said prayer changes things, and that may be true. I've also heard it said prayer changes people. That also may be true. But there's one statement about prayer that I can say from my experience with certainty to be true, and that is prayer changes. That's it. That's the statement. Prayer changes. Prayer changes depending on the situation or the circumstance calling for prayer. Prayer changes depending on our background, our faith tradition, our theology. Prayer changes as we change. Prayer changed in my life from a practice that was all about me speaking to God, loudly voicing my needs and desires, asking God to intervene for the people I knew and loved, to a time of reflecting on ways that I can intervene to help bring about justice for all people. Prayer changed from a practice that was centered on me to a practice that helps to center me. Prayer changed from a thrice daily obligation to a joyful practice of self-care. Whereas I once entered prayer like a soldier going to battle, I now enter prayer like a weary traveler seeking rest. Instead of seeing prayer as spiritual warfare, I now see prayer as spiritual rejuvenation. The Buddhist poet Rabindranath Tagore, wrote this beautiful prayer. Let me not pray to be sheltered from danger, but to be fearless in facing them. Let me not beg for the stilling of my pain, but for the heart to conquer it. Let me not crave in anxious fear to be saved, but for the patience to win my freedom. The Venerable Mahathera wrote that this prayer teaches how to pray, and that Buddhists regard it as meditation to cultivate the mind. Throughout my life, the idea of meditation always piqued my interest, especially when I became a Unitarian Universalist. Whenever the topic of prayer came up, fellow UUs would often say that their form of prayer is through meditation. And while I was intrigued by this, because I kind of always wanted to be a hippie, and meditation was what I always thought hippies did, still I could never meditate. The idea of meditation, at least as I understand it, involves achieving mental clarity and emotional serenity. And as a person who is somewhat high-strung, this really appealed to me. I recognized that meditation was something I needed in my life. And so I sat on the floor with legs crossed, calming music playing in the background. I tried to follow my breath and allow my mind to just be. But it wouldn't just be. I tried reciting mantras. I tried focusing on a particular visualization. I downloaded apps. One time I sat on the floor wearing a virtual reality headset that transformed my bedroom into a very realistic temple in Tibet. But the harder I tried to achieve mental clarity, I found myself incapable of escaping thoughts of bills I needed to pay and papers I needed to grade, lessons to plan, chapters to read, and assignments to complete. Despite my best effort, I wasn't meditating. I was just stressing myself out while sitting on the floor. And then this past December, I took my mother to her appointment with her neurologist. The doctor suggested to my mother, who suffers from Alzheimer's disease, that she take up a hobby and asked what she enjoys doing. I told the doctor that my mom used to crochet, and the doctor responded that crocheting is an excellent practice for people with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, something about muscle memory helping brain cells. So I went out and bought all the supplies my mom needed to begin crocheting, and I thought to myself, if this is good for my mom's brain cells, maybe I should try it too. If I can strengthen my neurons and make a blanket or scarf at the same time, that's a win-win. So I purchased a few balls of yarn and crocheting needles. It's bothering me that this is all unwound. And crocheting needles. And after about a week and a half of failure and frustration, I finally started getting the hang of it. I even started to enjoy it. So much so that as soon as I got home from work, I went straight to my needle and yarn. Then I started packing my needle and yarn in my book bag and bringing it with me to work, unashamedly crocheting during hallway duty and during staff meetings. One day, while sitting at home crocheting, it dawned on me that I was not thinking about lessons or ungraded papers, chapters to read, assignments to complete, or bills to pay. My mind was clear. My emotions were serene. The reason I was drawn to this simple, repetitive hobby is that without realizing it, this had become my Tibetan temple. I wasn't sitting on the floor humming and reciting a mantra, but I was meditating. This is the Afghan I made for my mother for Mother's Day. That's her proudly holding it. And this is the Afghan I made for myself. Thank you. But more important than the yellow and white Afghan on the back of my parents' couch, more important than having the gayest bedspread in all of Georgia, possibly all the world, every stitch is a moment of clarity, of escape, of finding my center. I'm not saying that we should all start crocheting, although I do highly recommend it. What I'm saying is find what works for you. Prayer changes. It comes in many forms. Whether it's pacing back and forth in an attic crying out to God, or walking through the woods and calmly conversing with nature, if it's reciting sacred liturgy passed down through one of many religious traditions, or meditating on a yoga mat on the couch with a ball of yarn and a crochet needle, find what works for you. In closing, as I was preparing this sermon, I wrote a post on my church's Facebook group asking my church friends for their thoughts on prayer. I was especially interested in the thoughts of church members who are atheist or agnostic. One response stood out to me. He wrote, "As one atheistic data point, I don't have anything comparable. If I can affect a situation, then I'm trying to make it happen the way I want. If I can't, then I just hope for the best. LOL." That last sentence resonated with me. I just hope for the best. I responded, honestly, I think when even some of the most devout theists pray, we are just hoping for the best too. In a religious community such as ours, where we celebrate diversity of beliefs, a practice as personal as prayer can be just as diverse as the people in this building. But there is one thing we share in common. No matter what form our prayer or meditation takes, it is an expression of optimism. It is an expression of hope. Amen, and may it be so.